Good evening from Oakland, California. I am Kathleen Gutierrez. I am a professor of history at the University of California, Santa Cruz, where I teach modern Southeast Asia, the Philippines, botany, and STS. Welcome to the online panel, Global STS I, Transnational Network Building, Asia, Oceania, and beyond. We know we have some more folks coming in, so we're really excited to have you all. And this, as you should know, is being sponsored by the STS Futures Initiative, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that in a bit. I want to make mention once more that we're recording this session and we'll make it available with closed captioning for viewing later. You may choose to keep your video off for the duration of the event. And please let me or any of the STS Futures organizers who are here with us this evening, morning, or afternoon, wherever you might be, should you presently need anything during the event or have any concerns after. I should share that the impetus behind this panel began with a bit of a world areas concern. I, along with other potential panelists, wanted to feature speakers who were working on STS in locations outside of the United States and Europe. We wanted to ask, who's doing the work? And more importantly, who's building the networks with other STS inclined scholars in the world areas in which we work. I, for example, was trained as a Southeast Asianist, and I absolutely glow when I see another STS person at my annual conference, the Association for Asian Studies. And so more conversations were had about the shape and direction of this panel that we're currently facilitating. And I'm happy to share that tonight, we're able to have a conversation with scholars actively building networks and responding to, if not shepherding, the global turn in STS. I'll cover the agenda as we have it. So tonight we'll have the space for 2 hours, and the conversation will open with prepared remarks, followed by a conversation facilitated by me and my co-organizer, Professor Jamie Morse. In lieu of a general Q&A, we will have breakout rooms where you can informally meet with and interact with our panelists in a more virtually intimate setting. And we will keep the breakout rooms open to the very end of the 2 hours, so that's 7:30 Pacific, in hopes that you can interface with our guests. And so with that, I'm going to hand it over to Professor Morse.
Hello, my name is Jamie Morse. I'm an assistant professor in sociology at UC Santa Cruz, and I'm just thrilled to be here. This is part of our two-part series on global STS that we're curating. And I wanted to share a little bit about the second workshop that we're going to be hosting in the fall. So it's kind of continuing the conversation on the theme of decolonial praxis in STS. And so we're really excited about some of the speakers that have agreed to participate. They represent leaders in Latin America, Turkey, and Africa for different networks that are being developed, a new journal, Takuya, and we're just really excited about bringing in other voices. We also have representatives from the Indigenous STS Training Hub led by Dr. Kim Tallbear at the University of Alberta. So we're really excited. We'll be in touch again with more details about that and coming up in the fall. And I also wanted to provide the land acknowledgement. So Kat and I are both faculty at UC Santa Cruz, so we want to acknowledge that the land on which we gather is the unceded territory of the Awaswas-speaking Yupi tribe. The Amamutsan tribal band, comprised of the descendants of indigenous people taken to Mission Santa Cruz and San Juan Bautista during Spanish colonization of the Central Coast, is today working hard to restore traditional stewardship practices on these lands and heal from historical trauma.
Thank you, Jamie. I'm going to hand it over to my co-organizer for the STS Futures Initiative, Elizabeth, to talk a little bit more about our programming and what's coming up next.
Thank you so much, Kat. I won't take up too much of everyone's time because we have such an exciting discussion today, but we are a grad student-led initiative based at UC Berkeley at the Center for Science, Technology, Medicine, and Society, and we've rolled out this workshop series with the funding from the UC Humanities Research Institute. And the basic impulse for putting together this programming was that there is such a beautiful, large constellation of people studying and conducting research in STS studies all over the world, but there are so few consolidated networks of specifically graduate student research and exchange and professional development. So I'm going to put in the chat our website so you can get an idea of the kind of workshops and panels that we've put together up until this point. We will be continuing with our funding from the UCHRI up until the end of the year, but ideally we'll be able to continue into 2022 and into the future because of this really exciting network that we've been able to begin building. So right now I'm going to put in the chat our email if you'd like to be added to our email list so that we can keep you updated on future events. We have our website here so you can see any past and future workshops, and also our Twitter handle if you'd like to stay updated there. I'm also going to put in the chat now a survey that we would greatly appreciate if you could fill out just to get an idea of where everyone's coming from, what kind of panels and workshops you think might be helpful in the future. And as far as upcoming events that we have, in addition to the really exciting second installment of this series, next month in June, we will officially be organizing the Cal STS retreat, which traditionally has happened every June in Northern California and is hosted by UC Davis for graduate students studying STS. But just given the fact that everything has moved to Zoom, we think this is a really, really great opportunity to open up that retreat and opportunity for exchange and, again, network building both nationally and internationally. So please stay on our social medias so you can get some updates on that, because we'd love to just continue building what we've started. And yeah, thank you so much, Kat. I'll hand it back to you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Elizabeth. So now Jamie and I have the honor of introducing our panelists, and I'll begin. Kim Fortune is a cultural anthropologist with research and teaching focused on environmental risk and disaster, experimental ethnographic methods and research design, and the poetics and politics of data infrastructure. From 2017 to 2019, Kim served as president of the Society for the Social Studies of Science, and through her scholarship and service, has evidenced a strong commitment to the transnational character of the society and STS as a field. Tao Fan is a postdoctoral research fellow at the Alfred Deakin Institute for Citizenship and Globalization. She's a feminist scholar, STS scholar, who analyzes the technologization of gender and race in algorithmic culture. Her work on Amazon Echo and the aesthetics of whiteness received the Nicholas C. Mullins Prize by 4S and the Most Distinguished Paper Prize by the Australian Women's and Gender Studies Association. She's also the co-founder and convener of OZSTS, a network that brings together STS researchers across the Australasian region. Grant Otsuki is a lecturer in cultural anthropology at Victoria University of Wellington in New Zealand. He has a PhD in anthropology from the University of Toronto and an MS in STS from Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute. Previously, he was assistant professor of anthropology at the University of Tsukuba in Japan. Grant has written about human-machine interfaces and the history of cybernetics in Japan, postcolonial anthropology, translation, and the anthropology of ethics in Japanese and in English. Jamie?
Thank you, Kat. Casper Boone Jensen is an anthropologist of science and technology currently residing in Cambodia. He is the author of Ontologies for Developing Things and Monitoring Movements in Development Aid. His work focuses on climate, environments, infrastructures, and speculative and practical ontologies. Alok Kandekar is an assistant professor of anthropology and sociology at the Indian Institute of Technology. His research has focused on infrastructures of environmental health governance in southern cities as part of the Cool Infrastructures Consortium. He was the lead curator of the STS Across Borders and Innovating STS exhibits at the 2018 and 2019 4S annual meetings, and is a founding member of the Transnational STS and Trans-Asia STS networks. He's currently serving as the editor-in-chief of Engaging Science, Technology, and Society, the open access journal of 4S. And Fichar Fajar Tufile is a senior researcher at the Research Center for Area Studies of the Indonesian Institute of Sciences. He has been a visiting fellow at the Max Planck Institute for Social Anthropology, the University of Tokyo, and the Tokyo University of Foreign Studies. He is currently working on digital maritime heritage and the intersection between area studies and STS.
So
So
thank
Kat,
you,
would you
Jamie.
like to introduce our presentations?
Yeah, absolutely. And so we figured that we would open up the conversation first with some prepared remarks by Casper and Fajar. I should share that Casper and I met sometime in the fall of last year, late summer of last year, in part because Casper was curious about STS, Southeast Asianists, or Southeast Asianist STS folks. And we connected through Vince Raphael from the University of Washington. And I think that really got us into some conversations about really the question of area or region in STS investigations. And so I think Casper and Fajar are really kind of primed to talk about this and then open up the space for us in our facilitated conversation. So Casper, why don't we start with you?
All right, let's try. So there is going to be something on the slides at some point. As you have to start, can you all hear me? It's all right. Okay, so so first, thank you for the kind invitation. And second, I feel I should start by apologizing for what feels like something of an imposition, which relates to what Kat was just saying, because not only am I obviously not a Southeast Asian STS scholar, I'm also not based at a university in the region, and I'm not even really a specialist. I simply ended up in Phnom Penh for contingent reasons. And from that location, it felt increasingly problematic that I had excellent colleagues and collaborators in Europe, North America, and Japan, while knowing pitifully little about researchers in, say, the Philippines, Indonesia, Malaysia, Thailand, and so on. And on that basis, around the start of the pandemic, I began a somewhat haphazard search for new friends, among other things that brought me into contact with Kat, that she just mentioned, and Fajar. So all of that is to say that I'm not totally sure why I'm giving introductory remarks here, but it's certainly not from any point of authority. So that said, what I can do in a few minutes is to briefly provide a sense of how I see regional STS more generally, and a few pointers for what I myself find interesting, in particular where I'm based in Cambodia. Now, the first point can be addressed in analogy with discussions about what might constitute the distinctiveness of East Asian STS, which have unfolded in the Journal of the East Asian Science Technology Studies. And I've put various papers up here. There's this whole special issue, and there are assorted comments, critiques, and elaborations in other issues. Broadly speaking, the context for that discussion has been East Asian dissatisfaction with the conventional state of affairs, where that region, such as it may be East Asia, provides case studies that are then illuminated and explained with Western theories. The questions are then raised about whether there is something distinctive about the area that requires different theories or methods, and about the extent to which they would constitute a break of some kind with dominant ideas from STS or even anthropology. And for that reason, probably a central rubric has been Asia as method. You can see Takeuchi Yoshimi's famous book on the right, where he just introduced that idea. But there have also been many other sort of circulating ideas. For example, well-known STS ANT scholar John Law and Wen Yuan Lin, based in Taiwan, have tried to sketch a series of traits that would be particular to East Asian STS. I have to say that I'm not totally convinced by the directions of these attempts. And to put it a little bit starkly, for lack of time here, conceptually and politically, it seems somewhat futile to try to escape Western hegemonies by replacing them with others, no matter their origin. Empirically and practically, from my experiences working in Japan and with people in Thailand, they indicate that scholars there are already formed which is not to say determined by encounters with numerous kinds of foreign thought that is not only bad or problematic, but also generative. So at least the relationship is complex. In a short reply to Law and Lynn's paper, I had occasion to evoke Isabel Stenger's minimal definition that she gave of American reality in a previous book as simply that which has the power to hold together a disparate multiplicity of practices, each and every one of which bears witness in a different mode to the existence of what they group together. Along similar lines, for me, the interest in Southeast Asian STS, and today, of course, we can expand that to Oceanic and beyond STS as well, would not be in a search for its coherence, which I find relatively doubtful, but rather in that the legacies of various diverse older and newer traditions create a tangle of trails, a disparate multiplicity in Stenger's term, that makes it possible for us going forward to experiment collectively with making sophisticated conjunctions of ideas and methods and problems and practices. Where this has taken me personally, so this is not about any more Southeast Asian STS, this is more a matter of saying contingently, again, what I've ended up being interested in as part, a little bit of this tangle of trails, is into questions of where infrastructures and urban transformation meets climate change and speculative futures. And I can briefly show this, and I am briefly showing this with reference to a brand new special issue called Material Itineraries, Southeast Asian Urban Transformations, that's coming out in the East Asian STS journal, I believe in June, with several great contributions from younger scholars and Southeast Asian scholars, Jakrit Sankamane from Chulalongkorn in Thailand, Katrin Eitel, who's in Germany, Miki Namba, who used to be at Hitotsubashi in Tokyo and is now in Kagoshima, and Gerili Muharsi, who's in Osaka, and then myself. Here we suggest, and in particular I suggest in the introduction, that the aforementioned and somewhat enigmatic notion of Asia as method, which in Takeuchi and Chen's hands become a method for new subject formations against empire, can be reimagined as Southeast Asian cities as method. If that idea is combined with particular forms of STS attuned to non-human agency, and then analytics of power, dispersed power, oriented to the many different translational possibilities of materials. So in this issue and other work I'm trying to do, cities, Phnom Penh, for example, emerge as critical zones, barometers that simultaneously measure climatic disturbances and changing techno-social, political, and aesthetic atmospheres. So finally, and to make it not all about me, this slide, in light of the unpredictability of events occurring practically everywhere around us, my own feeling is that concrete empirical analytics, such as ethnography, at this moment require various kinds of enhancement or augmentation, because it seems quite clear that neither existing theories nor existing practices and methods are sufficiently imaginative and radical when it comes to thinking through what will be required to keep practical ontologies livable, inhabitable in the near or in the medium or even in the near future. And it seems to me that I'm not the only one. It's not a eureka moment from my side. This is an observation that comes from seeing many initiatives popping up around me. And I just flag a couple of books and initiatives I've run into here, not because they are prioritized, but because they exist and I've met them. For example, the extremely evocatively titled Fragmentary Institute for Comparative Timelines, based in Osaka, which draws on student materials coming from across the world to rethink, think through alternatives to colonial timelines, what they might look like and how they might be extended into the future. Fragmentary Institute, run by Ashley Kimixis. Recently, Chiang Mai University in northern Thailand has initiated a new so-called transformative humanities lecture series that is interested in thinking through climate change from the point of view of newly emerging theoretical and practical formations in the region, but also English-based. And Yudanyaya, based in Sri Lanka, has published the Rice Punk Manifesto, drifting into a fiction where rice punk, along with silk punk and solar punk, provides alternatives to the steampunk and cyberpunk imaginaries originating in the West. At the bottom, I finally put a couple of books because I think the speculative potentials of bringing social theory and social thinking in contact with fiction is really rife as well. The Wind-Up Girl of Paolo Bacigalupi, which is about climate destruction in Bangkok. Bangkok wakes to rain again. This is a Thai scholar. And finally, you may not be able to see it depending on how your screen is set up, but at the end, Sigua, which is the first Philippine climate fiction anthology. And the point of all these things is, for me, is that I think that while Marx, Bourdieu, Durkheim, and the other dead white guys, sometimes living white guys, still provide many resources and should not inherently be discarded. They can be augmented not just by local different forms of indigenous thinking, but also from different kinds of imaginative thinking that tries to push forward. And I think there's something really exciting about that I'd like to talk more with people about. Yeah, thank you.
That was awesome. Thank you so much, Casper. And I was really taken by the ability to experiment collectively, possibly, and not recreating kind of the older area studies forms, but maybe moving beyond that. And it sounds like it has to actually also be very interdisciplinary to move into that field. Thank you everyone for who's also just joined us. We're having some opening remarks before we get into our facilitated conversation. And as I shared earlier, in lieu of a general Q&A, we're going to have a breakout room so that you can more intimately meet our panelists. Thank you, Casper, again. I'm going to hand it over to Fajar. Fajar, you should be able to share your screen for your prepared remarks.
Okay. Good morning, or good afternoon, or good evening, everybody. First of all, I'd like to thank Kathleen, is also the organizer of this very exciting conference, and I really look forward to have a discussion with you all later on. Let me share my screen. Okay, can you see it?
Yes.
Okay. Let's see. Okay. So yeah, I think my approach is kind of a little bit different from Casper, because I'm coming from the area studies kind of angle, and I'm not really a specialist in STS, but I'm an anthropologist, and I've been working on area studies and looking at the different kinds of development of area studies as an approach particularly in Southeast Asia and also in Asia. So from that kind of perspective, I try to engage on some kind of questions that been addressed by the Casper, also in by previous introduction. So let me give some. My presentation is actually consists of a few postulates. So it's kind of I'm just kind of using the term of postulate as kind of a shorthand to talk about what I've been working so far. Let me okay, see. Okay, I think some of the things is we always come across with this kind of work by Law and Lin, Anderson and Morita and among others, and I'm starting with this kind of critiques to STS. STS as a global knowledge that has been emerging and is situated in a historically specific Euro-American, or put it Western production of knowledge. But in that sense, then actually this kind of critiques for me, it's something that is not really new. It's as you might already know, that it began with Edward Said critique to against Orientalism and so forth. But what is really interesting, that this kind of critiques now coming to STS, and in terms of talking about the global production of science and technological knowledge. So this is something that is, for me, captures my attention. In that kind of critiques, then the STS knowledge in the so-called non-Western settings, people, you have to identify this kind of critiques, this kind of knowledge in non-Western setting, and one thing that the critics try to achieve, that this kind of identifying and redeeming and resituating this kind of knowledge, the so-called non-Western knowledge in the global context, is kind of redeeming something that is left behind, and put it in the so-called kind of a global context. But then the question is, how can we do it? And there is some different ways of doing that, and I think this is all of the authors, all of the experts that Casper already mentioned, and earlier in his talk, such as Law and Lin, Morita, and Warwick Anderson, and others. They are doing is kind of a post-colonial critiques, but in particular, from Law and Lin and Morita, they are looking at, in particular, more on the giving an emphasis on epistemological critiques. Is something that is very pronounced in this kind of a critiques. So it's began with kind of a post-colonial approach, post-colonial critics, but then going more deeper into the epistemological critics. This is something that has been going on over the last few years. So then it brings to the third postulates that I like to talk about. Is kind of if you look at this, all of the critiques to the STS production of so-called global knowledge, and then the critiques against this kind of production of the global knowledge. And for me, it's I kind of agree with what Casper already mentioned earlier, but I approach that in quite a different way. And for me, it's the problem is that some of the critics, or most of the critics, have so far rested on a spatial assumption. This is kind of a spatial assumption: the Western versus non-Western, Asia versus Asia, Europe. Oh, sorry, this is America, Europe versus Asia. So this is I think it's quite interesting, but it reflects the kind of post-colonial critics that we've been talking about. But for me, the problem is not in terms of either Asia, Western, or Europe or American, but the problem lies actually in the way how we started with the critiques. It using the area as a kind of anchor. So it brings me to a kind of ideas that to what extent then this kind of critiques can be intersected by the critiques that has been around also in area studies approach. So the only there is a similar kind of comparative angle from this kind of critiques, STS critiques and also area studies critiques, that both of the critics try to make the so-called the asymmetrical areas to become a symmetrical one. So this is for me reflects some kind of intersection that is going on, and that is even though probably some of the critics to area studies are going on without necessarily mentioning STS issues at all, or the other way around, but at least from the later writings in STS, you can see this some kind of the coming together of the kind of critiques. So then, but what is, for me, it's also interesting to think or to reflect on that in terms of the critics to area studies. Since the 1980s or 1990s, there has been critiques to area studies mentioning talking about area studies is kind of a politically defined and constructed. So it begins, in particular with the Southeast Asian studies. It began with this, involvement of the American government in Southeast Asia, and also it began with the support of the American U.S. government to the opening of the some Southeast Asian Studies department in the U.S. in the 1950s and 1970s, and then it became this kind of opening of the so-called Southeast Asian Studies. Then at that time, similar with the kind of the emerging of the country studies, So there's Indonesian studies, there's Malaysian studies, there's Thai studies, and so forth. And for me, that kind of things actually, in one way or another, is almost ironically similar with this kind of the emergence of these more kind of post-colonial critiques to in STS, the coming the emerging of the kind of focus on Chinese medicine or on state science and other um, uh, uh, approach that is privileging the kind of nation and nation state kind of politics. So I'm not saying that this is similar, but I see there is some kind of trend in the notion of this kind of topical issues that is coming out of in the 1950s, 70s, and also that is emerging in the recent STS critiques to the Western or Euro-American production of knowledge. So then there is another set of trend is going on in STS, and not only in STS but in area studies actually. So talking about this area constituted as a kind of assemblage. This Takeuchi's and Chen's ACIS method actually is I'm not going into detail into this kind of approach, but they are talking about this subjective interreferencing, and the way how the understanding the imaginary word will be. It's a subjective processes of interreferencing. So and you can see that kind of this kind of arrangement, different kinds of spatial arrangement is coming out of this kind of ACIS method. So and also at the same time in STS, like for example like Morita's work, we're talking about alternatives within, and then looking at this kind of ACIS method as a starting point to talk about polarization within. So it's for me it's a two similar side, same side of the same coin, different side of the same coin, that is talking about the arrangement of or method of alterities. So this is there is some kind of not necessarily epistemological, but actually it is methodological kind of reflecting about alterities. And what is for me, it's kind of interesting to see this as kind of a new kind of spatial arrangement as a method. That actually it's taking place at the same in terms of the formation of the assemblage that are constituted by desires, materialities, trajectories, and so forth. And Jen just kind of reminding me of Jen's Kasper's earlier talk of practical ontology and so forth. So this kind of things actually connects also the critics to Asia study area studies with the critics in STS critics of the production of global knowledge. So then it's kind of a speculative kind of thinking that I've been working on this kind of issues for quite some time, and looking at the area or Southeast Asia as a kind of a method, and I see that I'm not probably I will be happy to talk about this later in our breakout sessions. But at least for me, one of the things with the Asia as method proposed by Quan-Xin Cheng and others, actually they're not really talking about method. They are only talking in particular kind of a very small part of the method, which is the interreferencing subjectivity. So I'm trying to kind of looking at the method and talking about the area or Asia in terms of area or Southeast Asia as method. And what was really interesting to me, this kind of terms also was already picked up by Warwick Anderson in his 2018 article. They suggest the same term of Southeast Asia as method, but I'm unfortunately I have not a chance to read the article prior to this discussion. But in my work, I'm trying to understand method as a three has three kind of component. The one is the desire toward the past, desire toward the future, and the second one is the trajectories or direction of that kind of imaginary construction. And for example, like the science and technology for the nation and for the global or for the local and so forth. And the other things is the way how the materials conveys that kind of desires and bring that kind of desires towards a certain kind of trajectories. And we are talking about the materials, non-human and human constituted materials. So just kind of give you a fun thing about this kind of Southeast Asia as method. And I've been talking about one of my former teachers at Wisconsin, and we've been talking often talking about the durian, durian, and then you can see that it's kind of durian as a material is actually constituted of kind of assemblage. It can be pick up or probably discuss here is in terms of method. And you can see that durian has a very specific geographical distributions in this particular part of the world. And in terms of the fruit itself, it has a different kind of textures, different kind of that leading to different kind of processing, food processing and consumptions. And again, then it leads to a particular kind of construction of ethnic or national gastronomical tradition. So if you can see that, the processing of durian in Thailand and Indonesia, it's kind of different, but they have the same kind of desire. They have the same kind of love of durian. But that is really something that in Thailand, for example, it becoming different, because a durian now becomes a sort of national fruit, has some kind of interest. The state, develop some kind of science to produce a better durian and so forth. But we don't have that kind of a national science of durian in Indonesia. So this kind of variety, difference, trajectories, and desire, and coming together as kind of assemblage and producing Southeast Asia as a kind of a method. And the same kind also happening, for example, in my work in maritime studies. Looking at the mackerel, if you see the mackerel is and everywhere it's the same. It's a pelagic fish, but it has a different species with then leads to different geographical distribution. The mackerel in Pacific and mackerel in Pacific itself. For example, around Philippines, you have a different species that was found in Indonesia, for example. So it also leads to different kind of fishing practices and traditions, social structures that coming out of this kind of different fishing, different symbolic meaning attached to different kind of practices. But also you can see there's you can have the different understanding of when fishing history change, and then the availability of species change. Then you have ecological chains and leads to different kinds of symbolic chains of the value from mackerel and so forth. But these kind of things connects also not only Indonesia but also Philippines, probably in some part of the South Pacific and so forth. So this kind of assemblage that I think is very important if you want to kind of pose have a post-colonial critiques toward the Western production of global knowledge. So not only either or, but also not only coming out of the resistance and so forth, but also trying to see that the different kinds of trajectories, desire, connection that is also going on in a particular sort of area or region. So this comes for me the notion of Southeast Asia or area as my thought. Thank you, Kat.
Well, thank you so much, Fatar. I am all about the Durian assemblage. I feel like that's the way Southeast Asian studies now. I'm going to tip my hat. Thank you for that. And I just also wanted to share with the panelists that you do want to make commentary on sort of the theoretical propositions that both Fatar and Casper have made as you're talking about the real concrete work that you're doing in network building. I definitely welcome that. We're going to transition now into the facilitated conversation. So I'm going to hand it over to Jamie.
Thank you, Kat. So we've started with these two presentations, and we also, want to really kind of open up some discussion about how to do the work of transnational network building. So we have a series of questions that we'll be directing to a couple of the panelists at a time. So our first question is to Tao and Alok. How did you first identify a need to develop a region-wide network?
Okay, I think I will start and I'll ask how to chime in as we go along. So I think the story here is partly partly coincidental and partly also. So there used to be a Asia Pacific STS network, which was quite active in the region. Which was no longer functional when we were having these conversations around what does a regional STS formation look like. So there was certainly a felt kind of need to have a more regionally based STS network. The other part of that is there was already ongoing conversations between a number of people who are in this conversation right now. So Emma Powell is here, I see. A few of my Japanese colleagues, how Grant, all of us who were part of also ongoing discussions around a grant proposal that we are developing then to facilitate the formation of a regional network, which didn't quite work out as we had intended. But since last year, we have then continued the conversations as part of a monthly kind of virtual forum, and that where we just use the space to familiarize ourselves with each other's work. Most of our monthly meetings take the form of like 5-10 minute presentations by scholars of the region, just introducing themselves to hopefully identify then greater opportunities for collaboration. And so the hope there is to maybe build more organically, identify connections in the region rather than responding to any, there isn't a preset agenda here. So just trying to facilitate network building in the region. Since the beginning of this year, we have also started doing invited lectures. And we just had our first invited lecture in the month of March by Eddie Abraham, who is also, I believe, in the conversation right now. There's another one coming up later this year by Ivor Ong. I believe that's sometime in September. Yeah, I mean, that's that's where the network comes out of.
Thanks, Alok. Yeah, so there's a few networks we can speak to. As Alok mentioned, the Asia Pacific STS network was previously sort of a larger network that ran and then and discontinued. And in the wake of that, Alok has been so instrumental in founding the Trans-Asia STS network, but perhaps I'll speak a little bit to the network that I've helped to co-found, which is the OZSTS Network, which is short for the Australasian STS Grad Network. And this was a network that formed out of it really followed from the 4S conference in Sydney that was led by Kim Fortune, who's here. And the key organisers of that conference were on the executive and local organising committees there. And so for us, you know, being able to host that conference was a real catalyst. You know, we had worked with each other for over a year to try and put that event together. And in the weeks leading up to it, we were really like living and breathing that conference. And by the end of it, we had met so many people and had formed a community through our labor, you know, through our work. And most of us wanted to see that community continue. And to give some context, I suppose, to the Australasian region is, you know, despite the strong history of STS research in Australia and Aotearoa New Zealand, and the growing recognition of the value and excellence of STS scholarship in that region, it is incredibly rare to find dedicated or exclusively defined STS departments or institutes in our universities, incredibly rare. So most of us don't come to STS through a set trajectory, the way that most people would come to a discipline. We don't come to it sort of through our formal disciplinary structures. Rather, most of us just sort of wander into it. And because of that, the 4S conference then became this great sort of beacon for each of us to sort of wander together, sort of like moths to a flame, I suppose. Because up to that moment, I think each of us had sort of thought we were kind of working separately, or we'd found it through our own separate ways. And it was nice to have this sort of reason to come together and to have the support to work together to do that and to put on an event that then has really grown into something else. And that something else has been this OZSTS network, which started off just as a few of us in Melbourne in particular, launching a series of events. And now it's grown into an annual national workshop, which brings together, which is really focused on PhDs and ECR students.
So thank you so much, Tao and Alok. I definitely want us to expand on that a little bit more. And excuse me, I've got a lot of light in my eyes. It's the evening time here. But can you talk a little bit about more of STS programming? Specifically that national workshop, what does that look like? You know, can you run us through the agenda for those sorts of events? And then Grant, if you can also talk a little bit too about what network building has looked like for you. I know you work on Japan, you're stationed in New Zealand. How have you connected to folks in your networking?
Yeah, I can kick us off by talking about the workshop. So the first workshop we hosted was in 2019, so the year after the 4S conference in Sydney. And that was in Melbourne, and we really didn't know how many people would come, as is the case with so many of these sort of first off events. And we had opened it up to all graduate and early career researchers in the Australasian region. And there was no explicit theme. The theme was just, if you're interested in STS, please come. And it was very much not on, the focus was much more on networking and meeting each other and experimenting with practice. Being able to do things that you don't necessarily have to do at other professional sort of organizational network things. So, I mean, that what I mentioned before, that lack of institutional recognition for STS is an ongoing challenge for us in terms of, you know, legibility to an institution. You know, it means it's difficult to secure resources and fundings because the phrase STS sort of carries no purchase to management. So you have to find ways to frame it back to them. That they see as valuable. But conversely, that's meant that the OZSTS community has had the opportunity to experiment and grow in ways that I don't think are possible inside of those institutions. You know, OZSTS isn't obliged to do some of the work that professional associations have to do. You know, so some of that work that formal disciplinary programs have to do. So that means, for example, a lot of our annual meetings, we only have very short presentation papers. These are sort of knowing that people don't come from the same disciplinary backgrounds. So we have an emphasis on very short 5-minute presentations with about 5 people in a panel. And the emphasis is much more on putting on a conversation between people who aren't from the same discipline necessarily. And then the rest of the workshop is on experimental practice. So we've had film workshops, we've had podcasting workshops, we've had field trips to museums where we've let all of our participants loose in the museum, and they had to come back and pitch new exhibits that they would like to see to the museum curators, for example. The one that's happening this year that I just posted a link to in the chat was very much responding to the moment. So it's on situated practice. And because of the different kinds of limitations around travel, around funding for travel in particular, Australia is very lucky. We're relatively COVID-free, so people are open to travel, but our higher education system is under crisis, and students, early career scholars, just don't have any funding to travel. So one of the ways we've responded to that is to have a multi-sided conference this year. So we've got locations in Melbourne, in Sydney, in Darwin, and in Wellington, where each local hub is organising their own series of events. And again, the emphasis is on connecting people rather than scholarly rigour or sharing research. It's around sort of keeping people connected in a time when they feel like they might be feeling more alienated.
If I might sort of jump on some of the comments that Tao has made and add a little bit. I think there are, I guess, a bunch of different contexts I can speak to when it comes to network building. And I think Tao and other people in the chat on the call can speak more usefully about Australasia and New Zealand. Emma and also Courtney Addison in Wellington has been especially important to getting people in Wellington involved in this broader sort of regional STS network. If I could speak a little bit about Japan, I guess from a personal perspective, is that on one hand, and this is something that I think Tao is pointing to in her comments, is that the sort of interstitial network building, in my experience, tends to occur sort of parasitic on or as outgrowths to these more institutionalized meeting spaces. So that can be 4S, or it can be AAA, or it can be, the Japan Anthropology Society and so on. But those have been, I think, really important meeting points for a lot of different communities. Sydney, I think especially was that, but also Tokyo, more than, I guess, 20 years ago, close to 20 years ago now, was another, the Tokyo 4S meeting was another place where I think, people that you might be in Japan, for instance, but you don't interact with as STS scholars sort of gathered. So those are important spaces for that. And I think the Transasia STS Network and a few other things have been fortunate, I guess, in a way, to be able to parasite off of those and to jump off from them. I think the other thing is that the flip side of the strength of these institutions in bringing together at least people for a time and giving them the opportunity to go off and do something else is that especially, this is something I felt, and maybe Casper can speak to this a bit more later, is that in places, for instance, such as Japan, where internally, domestically, the community has numbers, right? It's of a scale that's completely different from New Zealand, for instance, that there is, it's actually can be quite difficult to try and make the claim for those transnational connections. This ties into, I think, the kinds of institutional incentives that exist in different places for creating the infrastructures, whether it's social or technical, to maintain those relationships. And so I think there's network building, I think, is parasitic. It's it's parasitic on these institutional, the more established institutions, but it's also ending up having to be, I think, scrappy, both in the kinds of tools that they use and in the kinds of connections and events that they hold. And yeah, so I think I'll leave it at there to give other people time to speak, but those are my thoughts for now.
Thank you. That's actually a wonderful segue to the next inquiry. Is we're really interested also in the sort of trans-regional and transnational network building that I know Kim has been a leader in, and Alok, you've also been working on this. So if we'd love to hear kind of how that fits in. So Kim, if you'd like to speak to your work as a former president of 4S and leading several of these transnational STS networks, it would be great to hear sort of the role that you think that they're playing, and maybe the origin story of one that's especially important in your work.
Thank you. Let me tell a bit of the deep backstory that will position me as like the old woman of this conversation. But I think that I was introduced to STS through feminist epistemology, feminist philosophy. And so a really deep appreciation for situated perspectives, explanatory pluralism, I was schooled in. And I think when I went and did field work in India, where there was this vibrant intellectual community engaged with conceptualizing science and technology, interestingly, outside the university, it really got in my muscle memory very early. That I work on catastrophic disaster, I think also taught me early what Casper spoke to, just incredible humility about the limits of Western imaginaries for making livable worlds. And so my commitment to the intellectual pluralism and it kind of runs very deep. And so when I came into the role as president of 4S, I took really seriously the simple mandate of the charter that it's an international organization. And I tried to say, like, what does it look like to actually do that, to build an organization that reflects that promise? And certainly conferences were a big part of that. I didn't get to invent Sydney as a choice, but it really was transformative for the organization. Emma Cowan and Thao, who we are here, I worked with, and we had a crazy transnational conference organizing team, which took all kinds of logistics to kind of hold together, but everyone very actively tasked to go draw in people from different regions. The other thing that we did organizationally, which I think was really productive, is we organized a ongoing, so pre-conference collaboration to build the STS Across Borders exhibit, imagined as the beginning of an archive for the STS community that was transnational from the start. But probably the strongest legacy of that is just the community that emerged out of it, has been spoken to here. And that ended up, there's now a very deep transnational representation on the 4S Council. That in turn, I think, engendered the incredibly transnational and creative new editorial team for ESTS. And so the way that things, both institutionalism itself can change, so kind of the opposite of what the kind of line of explanation Grant was pursuing, I think our institutions can change by these kind of scrappy maneuvers. And I think that it's still very, very important to press on the transnational promise of so many of our institutions, our scholarly societies, our journals, and actually ask ourselves, what does it mean to really realize that promise?
Thank you so much. Alok, did you want to jump in?
No, I'll just echo Kim, and I think so much of like the energy that went into STS Across Borders flowing into for us in New Orleans last year with Innovative, 2 years ago now with Innovating STS, and the new ESTS editorial team, like all of the editorial collective itself, but we actually have an editorial board that is very, very global, very similar to the programming committee that was in place for us Sydney as well. And so representing from the get-go, that has been a very explicit commitment that we would like to draw in STS scholars and communities that are typically not represented within the mainstream of STS publications and STS organizations. So yeah, I'll stop at that for the moment, and then maybe jump in along the way again.
Thank you, Alok. So Grant kind of caught me before I was going to ask the question about the challenges to networking. And so I might have to go back to you, Grant, to like explain that a little bit more, when it comes to the work that you're doing. I know that you touched a little bit on Japan, and you can kind of make this as much of a practical answer as a theoretical one. But I also ask Fajar and Casper, in part because I know, Casper, you sort of mentioned too what you've been coming across when it comes to Southeast Asia. I also want to acknowledge that we had Jenna Grant on the call, who works on Cambodia and STS. And so it was wonderful to see her here. So can you three maybe talk a little bit more about those challenges that you're identifying in the work?
Sure, I'll go first, and then I'll pass it on to Casper. I think one that I've already slightly alluded to is, and I think I think of it in terms of where am I encountering the most friction in making relationships that go outside the institution and go outside the national context, but also outside of sort of the Western centers of STS. Where are the frictions that come along with trying to do those things? I think one major one is in terms of language and translation. I think, especially with my experience in Japan, when I first went over there as a grad student to do research, I was, astounded by how much interesting work there was, written by people like Morita Atsuro, but many others in Japan, that was there, but not having the travel outside of Japan that I thought it should. I thought it could spur very interesting conversations. And I think, the situation has gotten better in some ways, but I think there's still a significant sort of barrier on both sides, right? And this is the sort of strength of the institution that I was talking about a little earlier, that, with Japan, you don't necessarily need to go outside in order to have a successful academic community. In New Zealand, I think, it's a little bit different. So there's this part of that is an issue of translation. It's an issue of language. It's about English being difficult and writing academically in particular genres being very difficult. But it's also about the entire apparatus and infrastructures around translation or around the linguistics of academic publishing that I think are also part of this. So, I like this idea of the Durian as method or assemblage and mackerel as assemblage. I think thinking about language or academic English as an assemblage and where the fissures and connections inside that way of thinking, how much does that define the kinds of connections that we can make? And I think it's actually a huge source of friction. I'll leave it there and then pass it on to Casper.
Okay, so yeah, Grant and I have been we've known each other for a good while and done quite a few things, lived in Japan at the same time also when I was in Osaka and he was in Tsukuba. So yeah, but of course our positions also somewhat different. Well, let me see. I don't want it all to be about Japan, but see if we can create some kind of bridge. But I think Japan is instructive in some senses, because I mean, I came there to work after having visited a little bit. So actually I never studied anything in Japan. I was good friends with Atsuro Morita and became good friends with other people. And they were incredibly interested in opening up and doing more international things. And creating a more vibrant sort of intersection between anthropology and STS at the time. But I suppose the reason why they were so interested in that was because their own position as STS anthropologist was relatively precarious and not very well recognized, right? So there's a relation between these things, and it is the one Grant is talking about, that those who are working in anthropology, which is 98% on more conventional issues, didn't have that problem, right? So, but my first observation back then was similar to Grant's. I think that lots and lots of stuff are going on. It doesn't travel anywhere. And meanwhile, a lot of European and American anthropologists are coming over to study Japanese things. And it seemed to me that there was a huge, it was parallel worlds, like it may be better now, but they didn't read much Japanese scholarship. And many I met didn't have any Japanese institutional connections, hardly, except for the formal one they needed to go out and do their study. I suppose related to this idea of not getting too polluted by the intellectual field, if you will. I mean, I'm not going, just because I'm going to Japan, doesn't mean I have to engage with the intellectual scene there, because after all, I'm going to study something rural. So I don't want to be sort of captured by the knowledge that exists in a certain sense. It's my feeling. Anyway, so these two very strong parallel worlds existed, I feel, and it was silly in a way, but it was also understandable. And I think what Morita did, and I supported, and Grant participated in also from a different position, was creating bridges. So I think there are more bridges and more interesting bridges, especially from the Osaka side now, but they're not that strong, and they're scrappy, as Grant says. And it is in part because it's not really necessary for most people to deal with things on the outside. I mean, but Japan is a curious case here. I mean, there may be similarities in other Southeast Asian countries in the sense that, I mean, people are grouped around a professor, right? I mean, they call it a lab, right? Or Morita's lab and so on. And that will sort of take care of the scenery and protect them and help them with funds and see if you can position them to get jobs. And fitting into that role is far more important than going to an extant conference. I mean, we've had Wakana Suzuki was here I saw before. She's one of the few who's wanted to do things differently. But it's really not. It hasn't been easy to generate much excitement outside a very localized circle. So I think for me, that's perplexing. I never figured out exactly how to break it. I mean, it is super scrappy, and I would like it to be different. But so my experience from Japan is this extreme satisfaction of working together with Morita and his colleagues and his lab, and this kind of the tentacles to different parts of Japan where there are connections like Tsukuba, for example, and some people in Tokyo. But it's also disappointment that in 10 years, we couldn't really do more. We didn't manage to do that much more than build one good group that now has an international presence. So when I moved to Cambodia, I thought, like, I'm not into this institution building, this kind of failed efforts to aggregate stuff. I'd rather search for people that are already dedicated and then have a sort of loose but strong set of connections with people to draw on. And that led me to Fajar, for example. And searching for people in the Philippines, it led me to Kat, who was not in the Philippines. But the reason why I was interested in people in the Philippines and Indonesia was for the same reason I was interested in Morita in Japan, that I don't have any problem finding STS scholars, like white guys or women, that like to travel here and then go home and write about it. And they can write about it in nice ways and exciting ways and decolonial ways, but that's not necessarily anything to do with what's going on in Thai, Cambodian, or Philippine intellectual environments, not necessarily, right? So I wanted to find people in the countries to see what could be done with those, but they had to have sort of already a strong interest in reaching out, which means that in a certain sense, I think I was looking for people like Morita, but in different countries, because in Japan, he was the one who really, really wanted to push outside and do something different. And I don't know. So this is almost the inverse of Kim's efforts, which are really enormous and impressive, and I admire them. But you can see, at least from my sort of more fragile position, I was just trying to find something that would be sufficiently, like something localized that would be sufficiently strong and interesting to keep some connections in place. I suspect, for example, with Thailand, it may be quite different from Japan. I'm still working with people in Chulalongkorn and Chiang Mai, and it seems that there's a more sort of open-ended orientation to non-Thai scholarship and bringing it into closer contact. And it may well be because Japan is, after all, such a big country, right? As you say, it's like Thailand. If you have to be successful in Thailand, I think you need to go outside, like in New Zealand and Denmark, but not in Japan. So there are these specificities to it. But again, I don't know very well, and this is why I contacted my friends here in the first place. I don't think I can add more.
Thank you, Casper. I'll hand that over to the Fajar. Can you talk a little bit too about some of the challenges you've been coming across as well?
Yeah, I think in particular in Indonesia, the way we do not only STS thing but also in terms of social science in general is that there is some kind of what I call it always the haunting experience of the authoritarianism. You know, it's kind of we are coming out of the 32 years of Suharto's authoritarian rules, in which, you know, the role of the society, civil society, was kind of suppressed, and now it's coming out of that kind of particular historical experience. There is some kind of sort of the way how we want to always, you know, kind of giving something to the society, you know. So if you do something like you know, social science, STS or history or something else, you know, many other things, then the question that you always have to face is that, you know, what is the benefits for local people, you know. And I think in one way that is a good thing, you know, because you always, you know, as you say that, you know, usually the social scientists or academics always, you know, stay in that kind of towers and then fail to look at, you know, they don't really look at what is going on in the society. But on the other hand, is that it's kind of giving you kind of pressures, you know, when you want to build this kind of, for example, transnational connection, this kind of transnational work, working on the transnational issues, then this kind of a question is always haunting you, know. It happens in my institution, for example, Indonesian Institute of Sciences. If we are doing a project, for example, studying Japan or studying Southeast Asia, then the question that is coming out of this, you know, the government kind of a sector. The Indonesian Institute of Sciences actually is a government research institution. I'm sorry. Then the question is, what is the benefit for you know, for Indonesian people? So that's why most of the STS work in Indonesia, it's always dealing with the state, you know. It's always dealing with the kind of criticizing the state, criticizing the what is the policy, and this kind of things becoming very popular in Indonesia. So the issue of transnational connection, the issue of transnational topic is kind of being sidelined in that sense, because, you know, you're not criticizing the state, you're not criticizing politics, you're doing that for your own kind of call it an egoistical, you know, interest. So this kind of a challenge that have been going on, actually, at least in terms of my experience, that, you know, how to balance this kind of local demand, local pressures, local, you know, kind of epistemological pressure, I put it that way, with that kind of needs to build transnational connection, you know. And area studies in the 1970s, 1980s, it didn't have that kind of problem, because area studies or Indonesian studies at that time mostly was a study of the state, study of, you know, of the Indonesian politics. So in that sense, people doing area studies in the 1970s, 80s didn't have that kind of problem. You know, you always, you know, doing area studies, meaning that you are serving your society because you're doing a critic to this against the state and so forth. But once this kind of situation are kind of breaking out, and then that's why the problems start to emerge, and it happens also in disciplines or in work like STS. So this kind of balance between what your local demands, what local people demands, and what is going on in transnational context, it's really a challenge for us, at least for Indonesian, not only STS scholars but also social science scholars in general. Thank you, Kat.
Thank you. One of the themes that we wanted to pull through this workshop and kind of thinking ahead to the next one that we're planning on, Decolonial Praxis and STS, is to think about that in the context of publishing. And so I'd really be interested to hear more from Alok and Kim, the work that you've been doing to kind of open up publishing opportunities. Alok, I'd love to hear more about your vision as the new editor of Engaging Science, Technology, and Society, and just also your work and the work of others with the Transnational STS Publishing Group.
Thanks. I'll start saying a little bit about the STS, and again, there's others. Grant is here, who is also part of the STS team, and please do chime in. We are quite mindful from the outset. I mean, so one of the things that we had a panel on transnational STS, and specifically transnational STS publishing at last year's Flores. And Noela Nanitzi, who was one of our associate editors from Brazil, she had this really eye-opening, insightful paper, something we already knew in some ways, yet hadn't quite closely analyzed enough, is to think about publishing practices within STS, right? And within the top 10 kind of, or the most recognized STS journals, to think about where the authorship is coming from, where the reviewership potentially, which is much more opaque, where is that coming from, who is where are the editorial boards coming from, and close to 90-95% of publications, including in ESTS itself, all of them have prominently featured scholars from the US and Western Europe, so not even Australia, so I mean not even the West as we typically think about it, right? And so this is something that we are really mindful of as we go into our editorship and thinking about how do we, it's not as if from this conversation, it is amply clear that it's not as if STS scholarship isn't happening in other places. It's been there, it's being represented potentially in other venues, but not necessarily in STS journals. So what we are doing at the moment is hosting a number of initiatives to try and just think about what would make it a more inclusive, a more inviting kind of space. How is it that we encourage scholarship from other places to come to ESTS especially? We have a series of collections coming up, building on the STS Across Borders and Innovating STS initiatives that where we are experimenting both with simultaneously the archive that we have been now curating and ever since Sydney, to think about what would a crossover publication look like, for instance, where some of that material is in ESTS, but some of that material is also living on STS infrastructures. What kind of, I know this is a question eventually we probably will come to, but also not how do we diversify the genre forms, right, within which STS scholarship is happening, and what might that do in terms of supporting a more transnational audience. So that's, very proactively soliciting and contributions from from different STS formations is one thing we are quite actively doing. Trying to understand maybe some of the issues that are already alluded to in this conversation as well. So thinking about where is STS happening? Is it happening inside the academy? Is it happening outside the academy? What kind of opportunities or barriers exist in terms of transnationalization? Is it even considered desirable in certain instances? And so all of these questions in terms of just what is the nature of STS scholarship in different places, and maybe using that as a starting point. Another issue we are prominently interested in, and this is something that we have taken a lot of inspiration, especially from Tapuya, which is the STS journal coming out of Latin America in English language, but thinking about prominently there the politics of language and what that might do in terms of what is happening in the STS, who is publishing in the STS, what are the barriers and opportunities there. We have been thinking quite a lot about potentially what translate. Some journals are already beginning to do this. Tapuya being one of them, is to at least publish metadata in multiple languages, and if that might help publications travel more. But also the other way around. I mean, so right now we are supporting this initiative, collaborating with Tapuya on this initiative called Paper Labs. And Paper Labs was something that happened at the ESOC, as part of the ESOC conference, the Latin American STS conference, which was closely mentoring graduate students towards producing publications. But then at the end of it, they would receive support from the journals in terms of further publication support, in terms of trying to think about what it might mean to create these crossover kind of publications between Latin American contexts and ESTS, and East Asian STS is another journal that is in the conversation. So yeah, those are some of the things that we can look forward to. Kim, would you like to chime in on the transnational STS publishing?
Yes, just a couple things. I was listening to you, so I don't have my thoughts all together. I want to reiterate the incredible advantage we have that the STS research community in and outside the university is already transnational. And for me, there is transnational anthropology, just for example, but the proximity of a really transnational community is so there in STS that I think that it's really a loss not to leverage that. It's not represented in our syllabi, in our bibliographies, in the list of reviewers for our journals. I know Jamie is teaching a Global STS course, which I really admire her effort to puzzle through how to build that. And we have the Transnational STS Network has a bibliodiversity project, which I welcome your participation in, but I want to point to a double bind. In trying to organize that bibliography where it's not regional or area studies configured, we've tried to organize it around concepts that we might teach with. So just for example, intellectual imperialism or academic capitalism, and then try and kind of crowdsource ways people have thought through those conundrums from various situated perspectives. But of course, even putting that standard language in place replicates the way we know how to think about the concepts and the questions and the issues. And if the real challenge is to think from the periphery, get questions that we don't know how to ask, there is a double bind at the heart of it that is the best of intellectual work to figure out. So that, and then also I think that it's really important, it's so important to have open access journals, but ESTS is doing more than that. Open access opens up scholarship at the end of the pipe, so to speak. It doesn't backward engineer a different plurality in the production of knowledge. And so ESTS, that group's focus on designing collaborations that produce the content of the journal, I think is just really inspired. It also means that as a community, we need to invest in infrastructure that scaffolds that kind of collaboration. Collaborative analysis of data, data sharing, some of the questions of open science, which I know is a fraught and complicated area to move in. But I think that if we want to infrastructure transnational STS, we really need to go there. The Transnational STS working group. So the Transnational STS Network has a couple of working groups that are kind of powering it along. One of them I thought of to mention that came up earlier. It's not off the ground yet, but we have in mind one on STS program building. So like Thao's earlier concepts, we need to come together to be imaginative about how to program build in different places. But the working group that's had the most steam and has just been really some kind of brilliant presentations has focused on building capacity in STS for transnational publishing. And so we've talked about the EU mandate for open access. Leandra Rodriguez Medina from the editor of Tapulia was with us last month. All of those discussions are archived, and so people can return to them, and really trying to call the question, like, what's it going to take to produce transnational STS publishing, and seeing a richness in an ecology of journals. So at both Sydney and the New Orleans meetings, we had face-to-face meetings that brought about 40 people together representing different journals. And that was just, you really saw the wealth of STS publishing possibilities there, but also just a very nascent conversation across those. And one really nice project that's come out of it is Tapulia, not about, but in Latin America and East, based in Taipei, East Asian STS has now collaborations, which are interestingly complicated legally because they're cross-talking in journals that actually are owned by publishing houses. But it's this is the kind of experiment that I think will take transnational STS to the next stage. And as Casper pointed out at the beginning, it really is kind of collaborative experiments that is going to be at the heart of it.
Well, thank you. Before I ask my next question, I do see Grant, your hand raised. Go ahead. Feel free to chime in.
Thank you. I just wanted to add one thing I think that's implied in Kim's comments. And maybe it doesn't need to be said in this audience, but just, I guess, to reiterate that, especially working on ESTS over the last little while, I've realized how polyvalent STS is. So part of thinking about STS transnationally is sort of having your own sense of what STS is and should be messed with quite a lot. And I think, it presents a particular issue for editors trying to choose what goes in the journal or not, but also, makes us think about our direction and our standards. Is this the kind of thing we want to publish and why? Very clearly and reflexively. I think the other thing, and this goes back to things that Alok was saying, is that I think also part of thinking about STS transnationally is to rethink the nature of the journal and of associations and other things in relation to each other and to what kinds of communities and users that they serve. I was on Twitter the other day following up on some discussions by librarians, academic librarians, and one of them said something like, workflow is the new content. And I thought, that was quite interesting because workflow is precisely what we don't get assessed as like right academic content, right? But it's also exactly what we're talking about here. How do we create these workflows that connect not just the people who are already in them, but also expand them to other places? So I think, it makes us recognize our position, not just within STS as a discipline or an interdiscipline, but also within a broader ecology of information of people coming from elsewhere than STS or elsewhere than the university, and maybe, just through Google or just through Google Scholar. And how do we we address those kinds of communities, or if to address those kinds of communities, but also have some sense of direction about where we'd like to see STS go.
Thank you, Grant. Thanks. I love that. The polyvalent nature of STS. I know that these are conversations that folks are having in the Philippines, for instance. I'm going to give a shout out to Ruel Pagunsan, who's a historian of science based in Diliman, who's here. And I think this is something that we're continually questioning, especially for those of us in the diaspora who work on the Philippines, for instance, and how we're connecting to our studies back in the archipelago. I want to wrap it up with one more question. I'm going to give it to you, Tao, before we go into the breakout sessions. Kind of related to publishing, but I'd love to know your thoughts on how you think multimedia formats, for instance, can really offer a new space for different epistemological frameworks in STS, and if this is something you're coming across, for instance, in some of your work.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think there's a real lesson from Karen Barad to sort of bring forward here, which is around the mutual constitution of objects and agencies of observation with phenomena. I think as STS scholars, we're used to applying that to the way scientists use their instruments to measure the objects of analysis, but we too could sort of take that lesson onto ourselves to say that, like the physicist that measures the atom, there's no inherent distinction that pre-exists the measuring process. So we are using, what is the apparatus that we use to access our the object of our analysis, and inherently to look at multimedia, for example, as different ways. What can film and media do? What can art do? What can different forms of experimental practice do for us? And I think the exhibition that 4S has every year on, I totally left my mind suddenly. What's it called?
Making and doing.
Making and doing, my apologies. Making and doing, that is an inherent part of the 4S conference, is sort of something that we really wanted to carry through into the kinds of events that we put on here. It's a real eye-opener in terms of what counts as academic practice. And when you change what counts as academic practice, you can also change, who counts as a practitioner, and it opens it up in all these different kinds of ways. So, I mean, at the last New Orleans conference, some of the things that were really inspiring were, there were songwriters and artists as part of the Making and Doing program. There were a lot of people making games. There were people using new technologies in new ways, and there were lots of people using old technologies in new ways. I mean, one of the Making and Doing exhibitions that I put together was literally a dinner table where we invited guests to come sit to dine on what we called an anthropogenic table of elements, where we sort of took the idea of a table quite literally. And so that invited sort of new epistemologies around hospitality and consumption and waste and so on. And when we had little elements from the table of elements on little platters, and we'd ask people to pick something to dine on, and sort of what did that element taste like, and sort of what was the before, what was what was the entree of the element, which is like what was its production process, what was it happening, how was it entangling itself in the now, and then what was its afterlife, as in its dessert. So what was its waste, and so on. But I think it's important for us as scholars to do that, to sort of break out and remember that things don't necessarily need to be on the trajectory that we're told that they need to be. I mean, the other side to that, of course, is acknowledging the precarity of so many of our situations, and that actually so many of us are under pressure to make the things that we do legible to the institution, measurable, for example. So as much as we want to play and experiment, so many of us are under these pressures to conform and demonstrate our value back to our respective institutions in order to really just survive. And that's sort of a contextual thing I wanted to bring into, which as the conversation was progressing, really was present in my mind, was when I think when Fajar was asking, what does the local demand? That's certainly a part of my local context, is the precarity of labour and the pressures that there are on young academics in particular.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that. That sounds like a wonderful exercise, by the way, to bring into the classroom. So I'll keep that noted. I wanted to also acknowledge that Fajar, you have your hand raised, and so we're going to have you speak, and then we're going to transition into the breakout room. So why don't you go ahead and close the conversation?
Yeah, thank you, Kat. Just a quick point in following up Taufan's point earlier, that the way how local demand works, not only in terms of the institutional agenda, but also in terms of the disciplinary legacy. Like for example, in Indonesia, it's very difficult to have collaboration between science and non-science. Science and social sciences. So the work of for example, like the STS work, which are more kind of interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary, it's very difficult to be adopted in Indonesia because it is kind of a disciplinary legacy, and there is kind of a very strong boundaries between disciplines, anthropology, for example, and political science, and also between the science disciplines and non-science disciplines. So kind of like in my institution, I'm kind of been working alone in trying to break this kind of boundary, and the way how I do it, and in terms also talking about the collaboration, and we've been inviting people from different kinds of STS camp. For example, like a couple years ago, we invited Mike Fisher to come and give a talk at my institutions, and we invited E.T. Abraham 2 times to come to my institution to give a talk, and which and they in particular they emphasize is the importance of looking working of interdisciplinary work, but that it seems that it's really difficult to have a resonance in Indonesia, because of this kind of the legacy of disciplinary boundary is still there, and so not only dealing with this kind of a local institutional demand agenda, political agenda, and so forth, but also in terms of working against this kind of legacy that we have been we in Indonesian scholars like STS scholar and like myself, for example, is trying to works against. Thank you, Kat.
Yeah, no, definitely. Thank you. That was awesome. And so we're going to wrap up this part of the meeting with the conversation, but we are now going to move into breakout rooms where you can meet some of our panelists in a more intimate setting. Now you can self-select, so you can go ahead and pick the breakout room which you'd like to join. And so we're dividing them by Kim and Alok, Casper and Fajar, and then Tao and Grant. And again, you can move in between them. We're going to keep the space open until 7:30 Pacific. And so feel free. I'm going to go ahead and open the breakout rooms now. Please use this as an opportunity to ask any questions that you've put in the chat. I know Baker has been keeping a log of those, but then also introduce yourself. This is networking after all. And then for our panelists, please select your own room. That would be great. Jamie, and just so you can see, are people able to self-select here?
Wait, what do you mean select our own room? Are you going to give us a number or something?
There seems to be a button at the bottom right where you can click on breakout rooms, like which one to join. Am I the only one seeing that? Yeah, it seems like people are starting to choose them. Perfect.
Yeah, so Kim, you have a room called Kim and Alok, so you can self-select to go there. Casper and Fajar, if you can go to the Casper and Fajar room, and same thing for Grant and Tao.
And once again, for all our participants who aren't as used to using this platform, you just want to hover your mouse over the ribbon at the bottom. Something that looks like a 4-square window will pop up. It'll say breakout rooms. You click on that and you can select which room you want to go into.
Thank you, Baker.
I'm a Zoom aficionado.
Great. I'm going to go ahead and pause the recording, and I am going to join the Southeast Asia room.
Awesome. I will hold it down in here.
Thank you, Lois. Thank you so much, everybody, for your time in the breakout sessions. I could at least say for mine that Fajar's Durian assemblage took center stage. That was exciting. I want to be respectful of our panelists' time. I know that, giving 2+ hours for this event is quite a bit. And so we're going to end here, but I hope that you all feel encouraged to reach out to the panelists at some point. These conversations are not ending, obviously. I mean, I think there's a huge, huge push for a lot of this transnational building. Thank you so much to Jamie for co-moderating excellently. And everyone have a good evening, a good morning, a good afternoon.
And if I could just say thank you to the whole team. This was really excellent. And I just want to thank the STS Futures Initiative team for putting it on and making it happen. And again, thanks to all of our panelists for your time. This was just really wonderful.
Thanks, everybody.
Yeah, thanks so much. It's really awesome.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, the panelists.
Everyone. Great organizing.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.